For nearly 3 decades, Michael Vick lived as two men at the same time. One existed in stadium lights, highlight reels, and Sunday worship. The other lived quietly, protected by loyalty, habit, and a silence so deep that no amount of fame ever disturbed it. The tragedy of Michael Vick is not that he fell suddenly. It is that he rose spectacularly while never truly leaving his past behind. Long before America knew his name, Michael Vick learned how survival worked. He grew up in Newport News, Virginia, a place where rules were flexible but loyalty was absolute. In that environment, questioning the behavior of people close to you was dangerous. Silence was not weakness, it was protection. You learned early that respect wasn't negotiated, it was enforced, and that the fastest way to lose everything was to forget where you came from. Football didn't change those lessons. It simply gave him a way out. When Vick discovered football, it felt less like a passion and more like a release. On the field, he was untouchable. The game slowed down for him in a way it never did for anyone else. Speed, instinct, improvisation, he possessed all of it naturally. Coaches could teach mechanics, but they couldn't teach what Vick had. By the time he reached Virginia Tech, he wasn't just a promising athlete. He was a phenomenon. And with that rise came something subtle but dangerous: insulation. Success didn't force Michael Vick to reevaluate his life. It did the opposite. It allowed him to compartmentalize. His public world exploded forward. National television, Heisman conversations, endless praise, while his private world stayed frozen in place. The same people, the same codes, the same behaviors that had always existed, unquestioned and unchallenged. No one pressed him to change because no one wanted to interrupt greatness. When Atlanta Falcons drafted him first overall, Michael Vick became more than a quarterback. He became a symbol, a new vision of the NFL, a cultural breakthrough, proof that the future had arrived. The league built marketing around him. Fans defended him instinctively. Sponsors wrapped him in money and expectation. And symbols, by their nature, are rarely examined too closely. His days became filled with games, practices, appearances, interviews. To the outside world, it looked overwhelming. To Vick, it was perfect. The busier his public life became, the less anyone noticed what stayed the same beneath it. Fame didn't expose his private world. It hid it. What most people never understood is this: Michael Vick wasn't secretly violating his values. He was living with two completely different moral systems at the same time. One governed by contracts, cameras, and applause. The other governed by loyalty, normalization, and silence. As long as those two worlds never collided, there was no reason for him to confront the contradiction. And for years, they didn't. There were whispers, of course, small moments that fell off, rumors that never gained traction. But they were drowned out by touchdowns, sold-out stadiums, and the belief that greatness always comes with noise. Nobody wanted to look too closely, because looking too closely might break the illusion. Unchecked fame has a unique power. It doesn't erase wrongdoing. It postpones accountability. By the time the truth began to surface, it didn't arrive as a surprise. It arrived like an explosion that had been building pressure for decades. The two lives Michael Vick had kept perfectly separated were about to occupy the same space for the first time. And when that happened, only one of them was going to survive. The collapse did not begin with sirens or headlines. It began quietly, the way most truths do when they have been hidden for too long. A routine investigation, an unrelated charge, a property no one paid attention to because no one believed there was anything worth finding there. Michael Vick was still winning games, still protected by the momentum of success, still living inside the assumption that nothing serious could touch him. That assumption would be his undoing. When authorities first turned their attention toward a remote property in rural Virginia, there was no urgency, no drama, just questions. But questions are dangerous when a life is built on separation. Every answer tightened the space between the two worlds Vick had kept apart for decades. And slowly, almost methodically, the wall between them began to crack. Inside his private circle, panic set in long before the public knew anything was wrong. Loyalty, the same force that had protected him for years, now became a liability. Silence turned from shield to threat. The more people involved, the harder it became to control the narrative. This wasn't a secret shared by 2 or 3 people. It was a system, and systems leave trails. For the first time in his life, Michael Vick could not outrun what was coming. As investigators pieced together evidence, the reality became unavoidable. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't a one-time lapse in judgment. It was organized, sustained, and normalized behavior stretching back years. The double life was no longer theoretical. It was documented. And once the truth reached daylight, it moved faster than Vick ever could. The headlines landed like blunt force trauma. Sponsors cut ties within hours. The Atlanta Falcons released statements filled with distance and damage control. Fans who had defended him instinctively now struggled to reconcile what they were reading with who they thought he was. The same media that once celebrated his talent now dissected his character. In a matter of days, Michael Vick went from indispensable to radioactive. What made the moment so destabilizing wasn't just the legal exposure. It was the psychological collapse of identity. For the first time, the public version of Michael Vick and the private one were forced into the same frame. There was no compartment left to hide in, no schedule busy enough to drown out reality, no amount of money that could rebuild the wall once it fell. And perhaps most devastating of all, the league did not rush to save him. The NFL had protected stars before. It had minimized scandals, delayed consequences, reframed narratives. But this time, the distance was immediate. Vick was suspended indefinitely. The message was clear. Whatever he had been to the league before, he was now a liability. Symbols are only valuable when they remain intact. As the legal process moved forward, something strange happened. The noise faded. The endorsements were gone. The phone stopped ringing. The crowds disappeared. What remained was a man alone with choices he had never fully examined, now stripped of every distraction that had once protected him. By the time Michael Vick stood before a judge, the outcome was no longer in doubt. The only question left was how much of his former life would survive the sentence. Prison would not just punish him. It would end the double life completely. Because behind bars, there is no separation between who you are and what you've done. And for the first time since childhood, Michael Vick would have to confront himself without applause, without protection, and without the illusion that success could keep consequences away. Prison did what fame never could. It removed the noise. There were no cameras, no crowds, no teammates slapping his helmet after a big play. Inside those walls, Michael Vick was no longer a symbol, no longer a headline, no longer protected by speed or spectacle. He was just another inmate, carrying a name that meant nothing where reputation was earned daily and erased just as quickly. For the first time in his life, there was nowhere to split himself in two. The early days were the hardest, not because of fear, but because of stillness. Time slowed to a crawl. Days blended together. And with nothing left to distract him, the questions he had avoided for decades finally demanded answers. Who was he when no one was watching? Who was he without applause? And whether the person he had always been loyal to deserved that loyalty at all. This is where the double life truly collapsed. Michael Vick has since admitted that prison forced him to confront something deeper than guilt. It forced him to confront normalization, behaviors he had never questioned, decisions he had justified as part of where he came from. A moral code that made sense in one world but collapsed under scrutiny in another. For the first time, he was forced to see those choices not as habits, but as harm. And that realization was heavier than any sentence. There were moments of anger, moments of denial, moments where he told himself he was being punished more harshly because of who he was, not what he had done. But those thoughts didn't last. Prison has a way of stripping away convenient lies. Eventually, only the truth remains, and the truth doesn't care how fast you used to run. Somewhere in that process, something shifted. Not redemption, not forgiveness, just awareness. When Michael Vick walked out of prison, he didn't return to the world that had once celebrated him. That world had moved on, but football had not fully let go. Against expectations, an opportunity appeared, quietly, cautiously, without fanfare. When he returned to the NFL with the Philadelphia Eagles, it wasn't as a savior or a symbol. It was as a test. Could a man whose fall had been so public exist again in the same space without pretending nothing had happened? Every snap carried judgment. Every cheer was mixed with discomfort. Every mistake was amplified. Vick played well at times, brilliantly even, but the game was no longer an escape. It was a mirror, and no matter how well he played, the past stood directly behind him. What followed wasn't closure. It was something quieter, a life lived under permanent scrutiny. Speaking engagements, apologies repeated until they lost their shape. Attempts to educate, to warn, to atone. Whether those efforts came from genuine transformation or harder necessity is still debated. And perhaps that debate will never end. But here is the uncomfortable truth. Redemption is not a moment. It is a process without a finish line. Michael Vick did not get his old life back. That life was gone the moment the two worlds collided. What replaced it was something narrower, quieter, and far less forgiving. A life where the past is never fully past, and where every action is weighed against what came before. For 30 years, Michael Vick lived two lives without forcing them to confront each other. The rest of his life would be spent living with what happened when they finally did. After his release, Michael Vick didn't just return to the NFL. He returned to a game that had moved on, leaving him behind. His name was no longer synonymous with greatness. Instead, it was tied to the darkest chapter of his life. His comeback was never going to be about winning championships. It was about surviving in a world that demanded answers to questions he couldn't always answer truthfully. The public's judgment of Michael Vick didn't end when he stepped off the field. In fact, it had only just begun. There were those who saw his return as redemption, a man who had fallen, who had paid his price, and who was now attempting to rebuild what was lost. Others viewed it as nothing more than a calculated attempt to salvage the remnants of his broken legacy. The truth was somewhere in between. Redemption, in the public eye, is not just a matter of actions, but of timing, and Michael Vick was now in a race against the clock. He wasn't the same player who had shattered records in his youth. The flashes of brilliance that made him a star were there, but the stakes were higher now. Every throw, every play, every decision carried the weight of his past. The scrutiny was unbearable. He wasn't just fighting for a starting position. He was fighting for his place in history. But that battle wasn't confined to the field. Vick's journey into public life after prison wasn't just about proving his worth as a quarterback. It was about proving to the world, and to himself, that the man he had been was not the man he would always be. He used his platform to speak about the consequences of his actions, warning others about the dangers of choosing the wrong path. It wasn't enough to say, "I'm sorry," in press conferences or social media posts. People wanted proof that his remorse was real, and they watched carefully to see if his words would ever match his actions. For many, those words seemed hollow. They had seen Vick as a symbol of invincibility, only to watch that image crumble into scandal. Could he really change, or was this another performance, this time aimed at regaining what he had lost? The years since his return have been marked by attempts to shift the narrative. He's worked with Humane Society, supporting campaigns against dogfighting, sharing his story with troubled youth, and striving to show that he had grown. But the question remained, could his past ever be fully reconciled with his present? The scars, both visible and invisible, never quite healed. The unfinished judgment. For Michael Vick, the hardest part of his post-prison life wasn't the football games. It was the judgment that followed him everywhere. Redemption, for many, was a journey that felt incomplete, a story that couldn't be fully understood without closure. And because the story of his crime was so grotesque and the consequences so devastating, the world has always struggled to let him move past it. The process of forgiving or even forgetting requires more than actions. It requires time, reflection, and sometimes a willingness to ignore the parts of a person's history that are most uncomfortable to revisit. Michael Vick may have paid his price in prison, but society at large has never truly allowed him to return fully to the realm of forgiven. To some, Vick will always be a symbol of second chances and the possibility of change. To others, he remains a cautionary tale, proof that fame, talent, and success are not enough to protect you from your own choices. In the end, redemption is not something one person can dictate. It is a gift given or denied by society. And for Michael Vick, that gift is still not fully in his hands. No matter what Vick accomplishes in the years to come, his legacy will always be intertwined with the mistakes of his past. The two lives he led will forever be at odds with each other, existing side by side, never fully reconciling. He is no longer the bright, untouchable star he once was. But he is not the same man who went to prison, either. He's something in between, a man who has learned, who has changed, but who will always be defined by the moment when his double life was exposed to the world. Michael Vick's story is not the story of a fallen hero, nor is it a straightforward redemption arc. It is a complex narrative, one that speaks to the fragility of fame, the consequences of unchecked actions, and a long road of public forgiveness. The world may never fully accept Michael Vick again, but in his own way, he has accepted himself, and that, perhaps, is the hardest victory of all. Even as Michael Vick worked hard to rebuild his image and career, the question of his legacy remained a complicated one. He was no longer the man who had stood on the podium holding the Heisman Trophy, nor was he the electric, unpredictable quarterback who took the league by storm. The NFL had changed in his absence, and so had the world. The gap between who he was and who the public now saw him as would never close completely. His comeback, while genuine in many ways, was also a performance, a necessary one for a man whose very name had become synonymous with scandal. And that's where the struggle began. Public perception didn't easily forgive, and public memory rarely forgets. Every positive move Vick made, from his appearances in community service to his efforts with animal rights groups, was met with skepticism by some. To others, it felt like an ongoing PR campaign to erase the past. The first few years after his release were marked by a mixture of cautious optimism and suspicion. Fans cheered his return to the field, but the applause was quieter than before. His performance was solid, but not spectacular. He was a player who could still make incredible plays, but there was always an undercurrent of doubt. Every success was tinged with the question of whether it was earned, or simply given as part of a rehabilitation plan that had worked its way into his comeback. The media coverage around his return was a double-edged sword. On one hand, there was coverage of his on-field performance, his return to form with the Philadelphia Eagles, and the way he had adapted his game to the changing NFL landscape. But the other side was harder to ignore. Headlines about his previous crimes never went away. Even as his career in football began to stabilize, the past was always there, lurking in the background. He tried to confront this head-on, speaking openly about the mistakes he had made and how much he regretted them. He used his platform to advocate for the humane treatment of animals, to educate youth on the dangers of gang culture, and to show that people could change. But no matter how much he said or did, it never felt like enough to some. Public perception is a fickle thing. For every person who believed in his redemption, there was someone who could not separate the athlete from the crime. He was both celebrated and vilified in equal measure. Some saw him as a cautionary tale, a man who had it all and threw it away, while others saw him as a living example of second chances. Perhaps the most significant consequence of his actions wasn't the suspension or the fall from grace. It was the long-lasting impact on how he would be viewed, both as a person and as an athlete. The legacy of Michael Vick became a paradox. He was simultaneously a symbol of personal failure and an embodiment of personal growth. It was hard for people to forget his crime, and perhaps even harder for them to accept that he had truly changed. The questions that followed him were no longer about his athleticism, but about his character, and that was something even his extraordinary talents couldn't outrun. As the years passed, Vick's career continued to wind down. He would go on to spend a few more seasons in the NFL, and while his performance remained respectable, the limelight was no longer on him in the same way. What mattered more in the public eye was his narrative, the story of the man who had fallen and clawed his way back. His career wasn't defined by how many games he won or how many touchdowns he threw. It was defined by the way people viewed him and how he interacted with the world around him. By the time he retired, Vick had accepted that his story would never be fully untangled from his past. He would always be known as the man who lived two lives, the dynamic athlete and the convicted criminal. But what made his story so powerful and yet tragic was the fact that he was never truly given the opportunity to escape his past completely. For all of his efforts at redemption, for all the community work and charity campaigns, his past would always be there. It was the shadow that hung over everything he did. Even as he continues to speak on the importance of reform and accountability, the public's reaction remains divided. Some will always see him as a hero who fought for redemption and won. Others will see him as a tragic figure who took too long to learn the lessons he should have learned from the start. The question of whether he deserves to be fully forgiven or forever remembered for his past will linger for as long as people continue to debate the value of second chances. Michael Vick's life is a story about more than just football. It's about the complexity of identity, fame, and the consequences of our actions. It's a story of extraordinary talent paired with extraordinary mistakes. It's about how the world can elevate someone to hero status, only to tear them down when they falter, and how, in the end, it may be impossible to fully reconcile the two sides of a person's life. For Michael Vick, his legacy will never be fully defined by his athletic achievements. It will always be complicated, intertwined with his mistakes, his redemption, and the lessons he learned too late. And for the world, the legacy of Michael Vick serves as a reminder that the path to forgiveness is long, complicated, and not always clear. Sometimes, no matter how hard we try, we can never completely escape the past. The legacy of Michael Vick extends beyond football, and it reaches into areas of society that go far beyond the NFL. While the world debates his worth as a player or a symbol of redemption, there are other, quieter parts of his life that continue to impact the people who encounter his story. Perhaps the most enduring part of his legacy isn't his talent on the field, but the way his journey has touched communities, especially youth, and how his narrative now serves as a teaching tool in the fight for second chances and the importance of responsibility. When Michael Vick left prison, the first challenge was to figure out what to do with his life beyond football. The NFL provided an outlet for him to return to the spotlight, but his true work, the work that would define his post-prison existence, was in places where his name didn't carry the same weight. It was in schools, in community centers, in conversations about morality, mistakes, and personal growth. It was a place where his past mistakes could be used as both a cautionary tale and a lesson in redemption. Vick's life story quickly became a teaching tool. His role in mentoring at-risk youth became one of the cornerstones of his post-NFL life. Speaking openly about his mistakes, the choices he made, and the consequences that followed, Vick used his life as a template for others to avoid similar pitfalls. In schools and juvenile detention centers, his appearances were not about football, but about accountability. He shared his story in classrooms and youth camps, encouraging young people to think about the weight of their decisions. His message wasn't just about avoiding mistakes, but about the courage it takes to own up to them and face the consequences, no matter how public or painful. Vick's presence in these spaces has had a profound impact, especially on young people who can identify with the hardship of coming from troubled environments. By opening up about his struggles and his failure, he provided a voice for those who often felt voiceless. His story became proof that it's not just about the mistakes you make. It's about how you rise from them, how you rebuild, and how you commit to being better moving forward. One of the most striking transformations in Vick's post-prison life was his involvement with animal rights advocacy. After his conviction for his role in dogfighting, many saw Vick as someone who could never redeem himself in the eyes of animal rights activists. But rather than turning away from the issue, Vick chose to confront it head-on. Working with organizations like the Humane Society and Best Friends Animal Society, Vick began speaking out about the cruelty of dogfighting, a practice he had once been involved with. He didn't just offer words of apology. He worked to show that he had changed, becoming involved in various campaigns and using his platform to advocate for better treatment of animals. His efforts have been recognized by many, as he traveled around the country, speaking to youth about the horrors of dogfighting and how the fight against it wasn't just about stopping the practice, but about changing attitudes toward animals and violence. Vick's story became a valuable tool for organizations fighting for animal welfare, as his own transformation illustrated that anyone could change if they were willing to do the work. While Vick's work in the animal rights community may never fully erase the damage he caused, it has allowed him to serve as a bridge, a way for people who once condemned him to see the person he has become, and for those who needed to hear it, an example that transformation is possible. While Vick has worked tirelessly to change his image and rebuild his life, the public has been slow to forgive. The backlash he faced after his release was intense, but his actions in the years that followed slowly began to shift some of the public's perception. He went from being a pariah to an example of someone who had hit rock bottom and was climbing his way out. However, full redemption is something that may always elude him. In the court of public opinion, there is no final judgment day. No moment when people simply agree that someone has done enough to make up for their mistakes. For Vick, this means living with a narrative that is constantly being written by others, a story that will never be completely under his control. Despite all of his efforts to change, Vick still faces criticism, particularly from those who feel that the enormity of his crime, the suffering of the animals involved, cannot be overshadowed by his charitable work. Yet, his ability to stand up to that criticism and continue working to improve both himself and the world around him speaks to the depth of his personal growth. In the end, Michael Vick's legacy will never be a simple one. It will always be defined by the complexities of his actions, his rise to fame, his fall from grace, and the painstaking journey back to redemption. But it is a legacy of change. It is a legacy of owning one's mistakes and working tirelessly to undo the harm done. It is a legacy of hope, hope that one can always choose to be better, no matter how long it takes or how difficult the journey may be. The story of Michael Vick is not just about the mistakes he made, but about the way he has transformed in the years since. It is a reminder that we are all more than the worst things we've done. It is a lesson in accountability, in the power of change, and in the strength it takes to make things right when everything has gone wrong. But for Michael Vick, this journey is far from over. His work in the community, his advocacy, and his own personal transformation continue to shape the person he is today. His story is a testament to the long, difficult road of redemption, and a reminder that even the most complicated legacies can still inspire change in others. Transformation. It has rippled through communities and wider society in ways that were impossible to predict when he first stepped onto the national stage. His life has become a complex case study in how fame, failure, and change can intersect to leave a lasting impact on others. Vick's efforts to repair his own life have, in many ways, helped shape the conversations around second chances, personal growth, and the broader societal need for rehabilitation. Perhaps one of the most powerful and lasting elements of Michael Vick's redemption arc is the way his story has impacted young people and marginalized communities. These are the very communities that often find themselves trapped in cycles of poverty, violence, and criminality, exactly the kind of environments that Vick came from. He's used his life story as a cautionary tale, but also as a testament to resilience. By sharing the details of his fall and rise, he has opened up conversations in schools, juvenile detention centers, and at-risk youth programs about the importance of personal responsibility and accountability. His message to young people is clear. Your mistakes don't have to define you forever, but how you face the consequences of those mistakes will shape your future. Vick has taught them that growth doesn't happen overnight, and redemption isn't about perfection. It's about willingness and effort. What sets Vick's story apart is the authenticity with which he speaks. He doesn't lecture from a place of moral superiority. Rather, he speaks as someone who has lived through the worst possible consequences of his actions and still found a way to rebuild. His openness about his struggles resonates deeply with those who have felt similarly trapped by their circumstances. Moreover, Vick's ongoing involvement in community outreach projects has allowed him to bridge the gap between two worlds that had once seemed far apart: the world of fame and wealth and the world of poverty and struggle. He has become an unlikely role model, someone who has experienced both the peaks of success and the depths of despair, and who is using his experience to teach others how to avoid repeating the same mistakes. One of the most significant shifts Michael Vick's story has prompted is the cultural shift in how we perceive redemption. Redemption, in many ways, has become a modern-day ideal, the notion that anyone, no matter how low they have fallen, can find a way back to grace. This has been particularly evident in the context of sports, where athletes are often given second chances after a public scandal. Vick's case challenges the very idea of what it means to truly redeem oneself. It's no longer enough to simply say you're sorry or to go through the motions of penance. The real question becomes, how much of your past can you truly overcome, and how much of it will always follow you? For Vick, this has been a daily battle, a struggle not only against the public's perception of him, but also against his own past. His redemption is not just a matter of public apology or charity work. It's about living authentically and consistently in a way that matches his words. While some have questioned the depth of his remorse or whether his rehabilitation was driven by genuine change or self-interest, his ongoing commitment to changing his behavior speaks volumes. The cultural debate around Vick's redemption serves as a reminder of the nuances of forgiveness and second chances, that it's not a black-and-white issue, but a deeply personal journey that affects both the person seeking redemption and those who must decide whether to extend it. As more people in society struggle with the idea of forgiving the unforgivable, Michael Vick's journey has prompted a larger discussion about the conditions under which we allow people to reinvent themselves. In today's world, social media plays a critical role in shaping public perception. For Michael Vick, this meant that every step in his journey of redemption was closely monitored, analyzed, and often criticized. Social media has the power to either amplify someone's efforts to change or drag them through the mud. And in Vick's case, it did both. On one hand, his transparency and willingness to address his past mistakes helped him earn the support of many, especially those who saw him as an example of the power of personal growth. Through his posts, interviews, and appearances, he was able to humanize himself, showing that redemption is a long, difficult path and not one that comes with immediate forgiveness. On the other hand, there were still critics who couldn't and wouldn't let him escape his past. Every mistake he made, no matter how small, was seen as a reflection of the person he had been before. Social media became a battleground where his efforts were often overshadowed by reminders of his darkest moments. The public nature of Vick's redemption means that it has been impossible to separate his story from his mistakes. This ongoing scrutiny highlights the complexity of the modern fame cycle. For athletes like Vick, public redemption is often more challenging than the initial fall from grace because there's no time to hide. It's a constant process of proving oneself, not just through actions, but through every word, post, and interaction. As Michael Vick continues to live with the weight of his past, his story is far from finished. The scars left by his actions will never fully fade, and the judgment of the public will continue to evolve with time. But what remains undeniable is that Vick's journey from downfall to redemption has sparked a conversation about the complexity of second chances, forgiveness, and personal growth. His impact on society, especially in his outreach to youth and his work with animal rights, shows that even the darkest moments can be used to inspire positive change. Whether the world ever fully accepts him or not, Michael Vick has changed the way we think about redemption, and that is a legacy that will resonate for years to come.